My name is Maria Angélica from Brazil. It's an honor to moderate this panel at the event Drug Policy, Extractive Industries and Human Rights in Latin America and the Caribbean, promoted by Brazilian Network for Harm Reduction and Human Rights. Today, we bring together experts from different areas and countries to discuss the intersection of it between drug policies, territorial governance, and climate justice in our region. The political choice to prohibit some drugs transformed into trafficking and the violence associated with illicit markets is an structural reality in many territories in Latin America and Caribbean. In Brazil, this decision continues to direct a significant part of public security and border control policy without, however, addressing its profound consequences for human rights and social environment sustainability. And at the same time, the urgency of reforming the drug policies has often been ignored and relativized by the community that fights for territorial rights and climate justice. So, to further this discussion, we are honored to have a panel of experts with different perspectives and experiences. I would like to invite Ricardo to initiate. Ricardo is from Peru, lawyer specializing in drug policy security and the Amazon advisor to coca farmers in Peru and former executive president of the Vida. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a really difficult position to talk about the close relationship between extractivism, human rights, and drug policies. But I am sure that the first thing that we should understand is try to discover the detailed components of the drug policies when we talk about how they are being applied, have been applied, and they continue to be applied in the South American Andean Amazon region. So we have to start pointing out that the supply reduction approach has been the source of all the policies that have been executed, implemented in the Andean regions. And that basically meant, first of all, the forced eradication of coca crops by different ways: aerial fumigation, biological control, voluntary eradication, etc. In Peru, in my country particularly, the government in those times decided to implement the monopoly of coca production, trade, through the establishment of a public enterprise, which had this contradiction. It buys very cheap to very poor populations in the Andes, and then sell much more expensive to more poorer population in the highlands. And that contradiction has led to several problems among the Andean users, consumers, traders, producers of coca leaf. So if we see which have been the consequences of 40 years of continued implementation of these policies in the Andean region, we see that the coca crop and the cocaine economy, which is behind the coca crops, has continued developing from the highlands to the lower Amazon territories, starting to affect the collective lands of different Amazon populations in the Amazon. This problem has been increased when the gold started to appear, the gold exploitation started to appear in the same territories where the cocaine industries had developed. And I found that there are several ways of relating cocaine production, illicit production, and gold extraction in the same territories. First, how the states had responded to both of them. If we have a quick look how legislation has developed on coca and on gold, we see the following. In the case of coca, through all the chain of illicit behaviors, we have the crop side is legal in most of our countries, or at least is not criminalized. The illicit part of the chain starts when the coca is transformed into cocaine paste. So you have basically 10% of the chain, which is legal, and 90% which is illegal. On the opposite, when we try to see how the states had responded to the gold economy, we see completely the opposite. Just 10% of the behavior is illicit. Is the moment when the person goes to the river and uses mercury in order to have the gold stones and the gold products. But immediately the person has the gold, it's very easy to put it inside the legal side of the chain. So you have that in the gold economy, 10% of the behavior is illegal, and the other 90% is immediately laundered. The gold, the illegal gold, is rapidly involved in the legal chains, and most of the Andean states are interested in having more gold in their reserves, so fairly easily bring the illegal gold into the economy, into the financial reserves, etc. So this contradiction, I think we should be aware of because it develops several consequences. First, in the territories, to the indigenous peoples. On one side, you have cocaleros who are not criminalized directly by criminal law, but they are forced to eradicate, or they suffer the consequences of forced eradication. But just besides him is the gold mining structures who are subject to interdiction, to police activity, but fairly easy they could bring their gold and put it into the market. This dilemma, in our opinion, brings a huge problem on how democracy, human rights could be understood in our countries. So we should be aware of that problem because that contradiction among the states, the officials, the authorities have several human rights violation consequences in the territory. On the other hand, we should understand also that the importance of the declassification process of the coca leaf in the frame of this extractivism and human rights approach. To get rid of this supply approach is very important because it will allow the Andean states to have a different approach to a structural problem in the countryside, which is the lack of livelihoods, of opportunities to get involved in legal ways of livelihoods. To make possible to think on coca legal uses as one way of understanding alternative development in the Andean region is very important. It will be easier to start approaching even to worse illegal economies as gold, in order to think on how to promote an exchange between the state of law, indigenous, migrants, and non-indigenous peoples in the territories by exchanging citizenship, public services that are not given correctly and that should be given by the state, in exchange of less dependence on coca or illegal economy, a voluntary reduction of crops, or even having more healthier ways of exploiting gold without using mercury, for example. So I will try to end my presentation asking you to think that this international procedure started by Bolivia and Colombia, it should be understood as the first step in order to uh, start answering for this huge dilemma, which means the convergence of gold, cocaine, development in the Amazon region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. I would like to invite Julio Cesar Estrada from Colombia. Julio is senator and current president of the Human Rights Commission in the Colombian Senate, representative of Guanamo indigenous people and former leader of the National Organization of Indigenous People of the Colombia Amazon. OPIAC. Thank you.
Agradecer primero al Padre Creador que nos tiene hoy aquí, dador de vida, dador de conocimiento y que hoy nos permite poder compartir con ustedes, hombres y mujeres, el día de hoy. También agradecer a TNI, por habernos invitado a los pueblos indígenas de Colombia a este importante evento. Rápidamente, algunos elementos que voy a exponer de acuerdo a la visión como indígena, como originario de la Amazonía, que de pronto no concuerda con muchas posiciones, muchos estudios por la realidad o por la forma como nosotros vemos el mundo, como vemos la naturaleza, como vemos la integración entre el ser humano y el ser, los otros seres que viven en la naturaleza, incluido el aire, incluido el agua, los árboles, la piedra, el sol. Todo hace parte de la integralidad. De tal manera que desde esa perspectiva, nosotros en nuestra historia de origen, en nuestra historia de creación, quedamos asentados en la región de la Amazonía, los pueblos indígenas. Y así fueron asentados también el resto de los pueblos del mundo. Los hermanos africanos, los hermanos asiáticos, los hermanos europeos, todos son hermanos, todos nacimos del mismo padre. Somos hermanos entonces, no somos diferentes. Pero quedamos con una responsabilidad. En este asunto de las drogas y el extractivismo en la Amazonía, varias cosas. La primera es que esa política que lleva mucho tiempo para erradicar, para acabar con el narcotráfico, desde el día en que se viene impulsando en el mundo, ha sido ineficiente. No ha cumplido con esa función de erradicar el narcotráfico. Antes, por el contrario, con el argumento de erradicar de acabar con el narcotráfico, de acabar con la planta de coca. Desde nuestra visión vemos que en muchos territorios lo que ha hecho es el desplazamiento, la afectación tanto al medio ambiente como a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, los derechos de los campesinos, los derechos de los que nosotros en Colombia llamamos los áforos, los hermanos negros. Se ha afectado los derechos humanos, se ha afectado el derecho a la libre determinación, se ha afectado el derecho a seguir siendo seres humanos, a seguir viviendo como nos dejó desde la creación. Eso nos ha afectado. Y nosotros con mucha extrañeza también vemos que una vez se hace, en el caso colombiano, por ejemplo, la erradicación vía aspersión aérea o de otra forma de erradicar, siempre hay desplazamientos, siempre se saca a las personas. Y en el tiempo pareciera, de pronto es real, llegan las empresas por otros recursos naturales. Fuera de que se persigue el tema de la planta que para nosotros es sagrado, porque es la que con esa planta se cura el mundo. Nosotros cuando hacemos las dietas o los ritos que llaman, en el caso donde soy yo, de Yupari, que es lo más sagrado que existe en la relación entre el ser humano y el Padre Creador, es para curar el mundo. Se cura el territorio, se cura el mundo. Se conserva la Amazonía, se conserva el mundo. La vida del ser humano, de la especie humana. De tal manera que esa planta, cuando hacemos ese tipo de cosas, es para curar el mundo. Y a nosotros nos preocupa que con ese tema de la sacar, acabar la coca, se desplace y pareciera que dejan despejado con el cuento de luchar contra el narcotráfico, dejan despejado muchos territorios. Entonces ahí viene la explotación entonces de otros recursos naturales, por ejemplo el caso colombiano, cobre, el caso de Putumayo, frontera con Ecuador, ¿no? La más grande mina de cobre está ahí en Putumayo. Ahí empieza el río Putumayo, que baja hasta y desemboca en el Amazonas, de tal manera que lo que se contamine en esa explotación, que es a cielo abierto además, va a contaminar la región del Amazonas, a pesar de que está en... Nosotros estamos de acuerdo con la transición energética, por ejemplo. Pero esa transición energética, ¿qué minerales se necesitan? Otros minerales, otros recursos naturales. Coltan, en Colombia, o tierras raras que llaman, también está en la Amazonía. Ahí está en la Amazonía, 17 millones de hectáreas en territorio de los pueblos indígenas. En el caso colombiano hay 17 millones de hectáreas que está lo que llaman vulgarmente el coltan, o minerales raros. Y entonces uno escucha al gobierno colombiano militarizar esos territorios. Tema narcotráfico. Ayer lo escuchaba a la ministra, a la Cancillería, a la ministra de Justicia, como estoy de acuerdo con ellas, que sí afecta, ¿cierto? Cuando se queman los laboratorios o se bombardean, en el caso minería ilegal, ¿cómo la contaminación? Sigue la contaminación, porque entonces queman precursores químicos, gasolina y demás, bombardean territorios, entonces sigue afectando. Si eso no tiene un control, es complicado. Entonces, ahí se queda la pregunta, ese extractivismo, entonces, si no es a través de la narcotráfico que se destruyen territorios naturales, es mucho más complejo que la tratación de recursos naturales que tienen que ver con. Entonces, eso tenemos que ver. Nosotros hemos trabajado, yo creo que nos ha servido esta lucha de años por evitar, por proteger la región, por proteger los territorios, por proteger la cultura, por proteger la vida misma. Nosotros en el año 2001 interpusimos una acción legal contra el gobierno del expresidente Uribe, que se concretó, perdón, el presidente Pastrana, que se concretó con el gobierno del presidente Uribe, una tutela para evitar la aspersión aérea que estaba siendo indiscriminada, perdón, en los territorios de la Amazonía. Estaban acabando con la salud, con los territorios, con el ambiente. Entonces, una acción de tutela nos permitió que haya una sentencia de unificación que llaman en Colombia, de la Honorable Corte Constitucional, la SU 383 del 2003, en donde creamos con el gobierno colombiano una mesa regional amazónica de concertación de políticas públicas entre los pueblos indígenas de la Amazonía y el gobierno nacional. El gobierno nacional participan todos los ministros y la representación indígena para discutir estas. Y se logró también entonces evitar de ahí en adelante que no podrá haber aspersión, no podrá haber, digamos, erradicación forzada sin la consulta previa. Eso es un logro en Colombia, que no hace así. Y ahí, desde ese punto de vista, o desde esa orden de la, entonces, en Colombia no se puede hacer erradicación sin la consulta previa, ¿cierto? Para y menos con fumigación o aspersión aérea. Eso se logró y ahí estamos trabajando en eso. Yo creo que eso ha sido un logro que hemos avanzado en la. Por último, sí quisiéramos mencionar que será bueno, vamos a seguir solicitándole a los gobiernos, en el caso nuestro, que haya una declaratoria, una moratoria, por ejemplo, para evitar, en el caso colombiano, la suspensión de la explotación y explotación de los recursos naturales, ¿no? Porque eso, dígase, lo contrario, la transición energética sí se requiere de recursos naturales, que en este caso está en la Amazonía. Entonces, una salvaguardia que uno podría pedir es que haya una moratoria hasta que no aclaremos cómo, si se va a proteger realmente la Amazonía y buscar otros mecanismos de, de desarrollo distintos a la explotación, a la extracción, o miremos de qué manera esos territorios aún se siguen conservando, sobre todo las culturas. Nosotros consideramos que nuestras culturas sí son la garantía de vida de dichos territorios, la garantía de vida también para el mundo, como ya se ha dicho. Bueno, nosotros ahí estamos de acuerdo con el gobierno de Gustavo Petro de que es necesario conversar con los campesinos, con la sociedad y no llevarles militarización o reprimirlos o atacar al eslabón más débil, que en este caso es el indígena, el campesino, y no el eslabón fuerte, que son los que compran y tienen la cosa. Yo creo que de eso se trata, de no mirar la Amazonía como una fuente de recursos, no mirarla como una fuente de enriquecimiento, no mirarla como una fuente de seguir fortaleciéndose algunos ciudadanos, no todos en el mundo, con el tema del desarrollo que beneficia a todo el mundo, dicen, pero al final la riqueza es para unos cuantos, no para la sociedad en general. Y la Amazonía es y seguirá siendo de alguna manera, junto con el sistema de conocimiento nuestro, la garantía de vida para el resto de la sociedad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias, Julio. Quero invite Rebecca Leder from Brazil. She is a journalist and human rights activist, member of the Secretariat of the International Coalition for Drug Policy Reform and Environmental Justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Angelica. Can I have my presentation, please? So what I'm going to present today is a diagnosis we have been building around the intersection in Brazil on land use and drug prohibition and how it plays out in terms of human rights violations and land conflicts. So for us, it's very important to highlight that although drug prohibition lies at the core of most security and border control policies, it's often downplayed or overlooked by climate justice and territorial rights advocates. So it's like people don't talk about drugs when they should. They only talk about organized crime and we want to draw the attention to the drug policy of prohibition, the political choice of prohibition. Next. So we need to keep in mind that there is a background context of violence, environmental crimes, and violations of territorial rights that started with the European invasion of South America and Latin America and has been developing over the centuries, over the years. And the drug economy is one of the economies that compounds this extractivist approach to the region. And in recent years in the Brazilian Amazon, there was this confluence of crises on public security, land governance, and human rights that brought armed violence into more remote forest and indigenous communities, and leading to an expansion of these multi-trafficking networks and armed violence and corruption across the region. Oops. So when we say that governance is under threat, is that we are dealing with the consequences of this discontrol over land use in the last, especially between 2008 and 2022. And on this map, you can see the overlap between shooting clubs, like gun policy, and the deforestation arch. And you can see how shooting clubs expanded along the deforestation arc in the Brazilian Amazon. Next. And we need to keep in mind that the main drivers of Amazon deforestation are land grabbing as a predicate offense, so it's a crime in service of other environmental crimes. Illegal logging is still most of the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon timber comes from illegal origin. The expansion of the agriculture and livestock farming frontier, especially cattle ranching, and now the Amazon has 70% of the deforested areas in the Brazilian Amazon are destined for cattle. In this process connected to land grabbing, the expansion of ore and illegal mining, both industrial mining and wildcat gold mining. So we have like 90% of mining in Brazil taking place also inside the Amazon region, and government built infrastructure like roads, highways, ports, hydroways, landing strips. So we have clandestine landing strips, but also government landing strips. And all of that led Brazil to lose a decade and increase its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% in the last 10 years. Next. Not only the Amazon is under attack, but also the other Brazilian biomes like the savanna, the Pantanal wetlands, and the Atlantic rainforest, where many indigenous African rural communities live. And so it's a national scale crisis in Brazil. Next. So when we talk about violence and organized crime, we are talking about this multi-trafficking. Is not only drugs, it's also gold, timber, biodiversity, special minerals, fish, and we have this overlap of environmental and non-environmental crime. And if you put the maps together of deforestation hotspots and homicides, you see that they overlap. So the same places where you have high rates of deforestation, you have high rates of violence and armed violence. This is connected to absence of territorial rights because we know when indigenous lands are demarcated, they are more protected both from deforestation and from other kinds of crime. We had like records of land conflicts, almost 6,000 conflicts per year that are documented. That means struggles between communities and invading forces, either agriculture, loggers, cattle ranchers. And we know that this is leading the region to have a GDP way below the Brazilian national average, like half of the Brazilian national average. Next. So as a key evidence that as we try to deal with the situation with the same failed war on drugs approach, the result is that we are having an increase of police killings in the Amazon of 71%, double the national average. We have mass incarceration growing by 35%, and we have the fragmentation of the criminal landscape. So organized crime is growing, is multiplying into different groups with different levels of power. and that is a challenge for any public security approach and governance attempt. Next. So as a premise for this analysis, we think we need to look at the two main plant-based drug commodities in Latin America. I know they are sacred plants, but once they reach the market, they become valuable commodities. And we need to ask ourselves if it's possible to reach zero deforestation while we maintain this ongoing war against native plant-based drugs. Because cannabis, we have Brazilian cannabis, and coca is a native plant to the Andean countries. So there is a clear contradiction there. And I've been hearing a lot of people talking about alternative development and controlled deforestation, but is that even possible, Next. And often we talked about Brazil as a route, but we need to qualify that because it's a transit region. It's not just like a road that cocaine goes through and leaving no trace behind. The effects are huge, and we know that the drug economy uses the same corridors that were opened by land grabbers and the agricultural frontier, and not the other way around. It's not the drug that drives the deforestation. It goes after the deforestation frontier. Next. So this is this map showing the cocaine routes inside Brazil. We know that the Brazilian Amazon plays this key role in this division of the clandestine labor connected to the cocaine industry in the country, is the main kind of port of entrance. But we don't know the extent of the structure to refine cocaine base in Brazil. We know that since the 90s, the volume of cocaine base entering the country has surpassed refined cocaine. Uh, we are also one of the largest consumer markets for cocaine and crack cocaine. So we are talking about between 5 and 10 million people that use this substance in Brazil. So there's a lot of money even for the national market. And then the port of Santos in the southeast of the country is the second world's largest exporter of cocaine, main destination, European markets. Next. And if you look closer to this map, then you can see how this cocaine industry touches down on the different places in Brazil, depending on the stage of this industry. So you have the entry routes where you find more cocaine base, and then as you move inside the country, you find the labs and the structure to refine it, and then the wholesale kind of logistics distribution is concentrated in some metropolitan regions like Belém, for instance, which is the whole city for COP30 later this year. And then you have the exit ways for the export market, especially São Paulo, Rio, Salvador in Bahia, and also Amazon ports. Next. These maps, they show the overlaps of those areas that are under dispute by organized crime and isolated indigenous people. Brazil still has around 40 non-contacted indigenous populations, and they're concentrated right on the borders and on the routes that are more and more explored by organized crime. Next. Also, the chain of value inside Brazil. So this is a map from the Ministry of Justice, and you can see that even inside the country, the kilo of cocaine base triples in value once it reaches, once it crosses, enters from Mato Grosso, once it reaches the Northeast, it's almost 3 times the value. So it's a great business if you think about the money you can make. Next. We also need to talk about cannabis, and I don't know if you know, but Brazil was the first country to prohibit cannabis in the world, even before the US. It's very linked to racism and social control of African descendants and indigenous people in the country. It's still the most used illicit drug and responsible for almost half of drug-related arrests. So it's a lot, and a lot of money coming from next a lot of money coming from the illegal cannabis trade in Brazil, and most of the Brazilian cannabis market is supplied by Paraguay, by monocultures in the north of Paraguay. So we play this very colonial game with our neighbor, externalizing the cost of the cannabis growing to Paraguay and profiting in our market and sending the profits as guns back to producing regions. Next. To finalize, our key message is that to deal with these contradictions between alternative development, prohibition, land use, territorial rights, public health, the climate emergency, we need to build new consensus. And I know that the CND operates on consensus, so we need to build a new consensus around this. And for us, is that there is no climate justice without drug policy reform, and that we need to consider ecological premises when discussing what kind of reform and how we are going to deal with those sacred plants that are vital for us and planetary survival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. I
Thank
would
you.
like to invite Fritz Pino from Honduras. He's online. Fritz is a Honduran journalist and documentary producer based in Tegucigalpa, specializing in illicit economies, violence, and development. Thank you, Fritz.
Can you hear us,
Welcome.
Rick?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I can hear you. The internet is really bad and the system is using up a lot of it. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I hope that I can share my presentation. Okay, just 1 second. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Can
Não
you
é para
see?
ele compartilhar?
Não, eu não sei se ele vai.
Does this work? I can't see you.
One moment. Yes.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Amazing. All right. It's very early here. It's very early here. It's 5 a.m., but I hope I can swing this. It's nice to be here, and I'm just going to jump into it right away because there's a lot to cover. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit about, something new that's been happening here in Central America regarding cocaine's commodity chain and what that affects, beyond drugs. Basically, I'm Fritz. I work here in Honduras, covering Central America. But I'm also as a journalist, but I'm also an associate for CVAD, which is a research center on illicit economies, and I'm working currently with TNI and Ohio State University to further look into this aspect of the cocaine economy and drug trafficking and the war on drugs and so on and so on. I just want to go really quickly into the basics of the classical constellation of the war on drugs, because just so we're on the same page of the basics of Latin America and the role of Central America in this in the drug economy. The classical sense of it is that Central America is more considered a transit zone, and that's sandwiched between the crossover zone, which is in Mexico, and a production zone, which is traditionally known as the Andes region, from which we've heard great speeches today. And from that production zone, it basically passes through this transit zone to reach Mexico, in which Mexican cartels have cornered the market and the routes to basically transfer the product over to the large cities based on the coast. So it's managed by franchises of Mexican cartels, who've cornered that kind of market of distribution there. So if we're looking at the basic constellation, we have the suppliers in the Andes region, we have the distributors in Mexico who sent it up to the US, who was one of the major consume hubs, and we have Central America kind of as a transit zone. But when we've been looking into this, we've had little singular reports, national reports also popping up all over Central America of the emergence of coca, and it's been very uneven. And there were some reports here, some reports there, but if you pull them all together, we can actually see that there's a large trend happening right now in Central America that groups are growing coca, and but it's still very uneven. The data is still very unclear. But and when I went over and I asked, for example, the military of what's happening with coca, and they just basically shoved it off as, the coca growers, they scare easily. We're trying to interrupt their operations before this turns serious. Or coca growing operations are failing because they don't have the conditions to grow it here. So it was always this kind of mystery cloaking the existence of coca here in Central America, right? About does it exist? To what extent does it exist? And can it even exist here? Can it even grow here? Right? Professor Kendra McSweeney made this research paper just recently with her with colleagues, and basically what they figured out is that, as a surprise, we've always been kind of thinking of coca of being part of the Andes region, but that it turns out that actually 49% of Central American soils have the environments that suit coca very well. So actually, 49% of Central America can grow coca on an industrial scale, which came to a surprise to us, but is surely not a surprise to the military, but also not a surprise to organized crime or groups operating in the region. So basically, we tried to figure out how severe is the issue of coca in Central America. How does it work? Who's growing it? So I went to one of these operations, and there was a whole different story. If you work in the field, if you're speaking to an officer, obviously under the condition of anonymity, he basically told me that we've only detected about 2 to 5% of the coca growing operations here in Honduras, right? So, and the demand is high. It's really a growing issue here, and you basically can see that these operations. This is a photo that I've took over there. They have to walk basically over to these coca plantations. This is how they look basically from above. And this is why when we're looking at coca plantation seizures, we have very low numbers still. That's because they have to basically walk through the mountains, eradicate this by hand, and then they basically just take some photos and then they leave. And we can barely rely on this data because it's also data by militaries. We don't really know how big it is, how much is this number inflated, how it isn't. And what we do also know is that in Honduras, they're not only growing the leaf, but they're also producing the coca paste. So this is a lab, for example, that's smacked in the middle of the mountains where they're making the paste. And but what we're trying to look at is what does the future look like for coca in Central America? And so I'm racing through this because it's going to get a bit more complicated here. But so if you want to look at the future of coca here in this country, you have to look at the value chain of the commodity chain, and which is basically the value added to a product basically that is being sold. And if we look at here, this is data from the crisis group from Colombia, for example, how the price basically jumps and why coca paste is one of the most resistant, stress-resistant commodities out there. And it's basically, it jumps from this low number to 1,000 almost US dollars per kilo, and then it jumps higher and higher. But then the main value is reached and added through international trafficking, but it also incurs the highest cost. Now, if we combine this, that now Central America has become a production hub. Now there's a bidding war between the suppliers in the Andes region and Central America, and there's one distributor who's cornered the market of the US, basically. So there's a bidding war between the Andes region and Central America, in which Central America will win this bidding war, and this is what we're looking at currently. So the cost of reaching Honduras, basically the product is almost, and this is the main issue here, is almost half. So if we have a product that wants to reach Mexico, by the time it reaches Honduras, its costs almost double than the same product locally or produced in Honduras. So what we're assuming by this is, but we're not assuming, what we're thinking, that this will push further coca production in the country, because if it is organized by Mexican cartels, they can basically save up to 24 million US dollars per one cargo of a 4-ton ship, which is usually the cargo they carry. And it's also intimately linked to other side effects that we've been seeing through the media, for example. One could be, the coca price crash, which came by the high production in Colombia, for example, but also could be, another factor could be that the demand has shrunk because of Central America as a factor here. Another effect would be, that now classical producers like the Colombians are moving more towards Europe, because they're trying to find new distributors, right? And these are all things we're trying to look at currently. I don't know how I am on time. I don't know, Rebecca.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2
okay.
minutes.
I can swing this in 2 minutes. So basically, this is the other part, which is almost as much as what I've just presented right now. But to make this really short, is that in Central America, in every kind of issue that has to deal with an illicit economy, we have these two cycles. We have the cycle that people usually see, what also has been mentioned today regarding illicit mining, is that first you have a cycle of production, of trafficking, of the sale, but then you have another cycle of laundering, and because of its illegality, and especially of the illegality of a high yielding product. So the main issue actually that we're having in Honduras is not necessarily the sale or distribution of drugs or any other product of an illicit economy, but rather the laundering. And so the first cycle of the sale distribution, we're having the issue here is that there's a huge replacement of sovereign governance by this kind of illicit sphere, which is trying to undermine democratic structures and creates tensions, right? And violent means of territorial control. But the second cycle, that is what increases, for example, licit and illicit mining. It increases efforts, basically like cattle ranching and palm oil, which are protected by the undermined institutionalism that this illicit economy produces, basically. So we're having huge issues here, specifically with palm oil and cattle ranching. And then that just snowballs into other issues like poaching activities. And the problem here, for example, just where I am right now, there's a lot of problems with palm oil. But if rangers approach palm oil and basically enforce the law regarding illicit palm oil, they are not only facing the courts, but they're actually facing the whole might of the illicit economy behind the palm oil. So yeah, that's basically my very quick summary about Honduras and Central America and about the coca issue right here. If you have any questions, you can send me an email. I have my email right here, but I'm going to stop sharing now. I hope that's fine.
Yeah.
How's it time?
That's great. Great. Thanks.
I'm sorry.
Could you hear the applause? Did you hear the applause? Yeah?
Sorry.
No.
That's the best part.
So I would like to thank everyone for coming. I was very honored to moderate this important debate because considering of that we are all victims of the war on drugs and also of climate events. So thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. And would like to talk about the presentation.
My presentation?
Yeah, the link or
Yeah, I mean, my presentation was not recorded for some reason, but if you want to have access to it, just please come to me and I'll share it with you. And thank you so much. We have another side, I'm just gonna do the marketing here. We have another side event with the International Coalition on Drug Policy and Environmental Justice tomorrow, 2 p.m.
No,
11:30, sorry.
with colleagues from Global Witness and colleagues from Peru, and it's on environmental justice and environmental land defenders, territorial violence, and drugs. And it's in this room, 05. 05, so next door.
Yeah. So hope to see you there tomorrow and have a great time. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Qué bueno, qué interesante, ¿no?